There's this problem that I run into a lot with anime comedies, and that problem is that they tend to get very repetitive very quickly. Even when the initial episodes are hilarious and fresh compared to other shows around them, it feels like they start to run out of ideas before the show's even half over and just rehash the same jokes over and over again. Then I started watching Nichijou, and lo and behold, the series was genuinely enjoyable all the way through. So what is it that sets Nichijou and other great anime comedies apart from those that burn out after a few episodes? Obviously, it starts with actually having a great sense of humor, and Nichijou is surprisingly good at that. You would think being a jaded 20-something with an excessively dark sense of humor would steer me in the exact opposite direction of Nichijou, but as far as more wholesome comedies go, it's definitely a strong contender. Not just because the jokes themselves are good, but because they're excellently constructed. There's rarely an excessive amount of padding before the punchline unless it's intended so, and despite how bizarre the humor is, there always seems to be a logical thread that connects the setup to the payoff. It might seem like lol random humor on the surface, but there's still a train of thought that can be followed through a joke. However, what really sets Nichijou apart from more average anime comedies is its ability to keep the audience on its toes. One of my favorite ways it accomplishes this is through the more mechanical elements of the comedy. Timing and pacing are easily the most important facets of the technical side of comedy, as misplacing the punchline can derail an entire joke. Nichijou knows exactly how to pace each joke in order to achieve the intended result, especially when said result takes a less traditional approach to punchline delivery. My favorite example of this is near the end of the series where Mio is completely letting loose on Yuko for not buying her manuscript paper. The punchline is obviously that Yuko actually did get the paper, and so the joke could have been cut off after the rule of 3 or at any point in Mio's rant. Instead, the rant goes on for nearly 4 whole minutes before we actually get to the punchline, with those 4 minutes being filled with the typical wordplay and animation brilliance that's expected from Nichijou. In this instance, the real joke is the fact that they were able to keep this rant going for 4 whole minutes, entertaining the audience the entire time rather than just having them wait for the punchline. And this is just one of many instances where Nichijou deliberately misplaces its punchlines in order to catch the audience off guard and add more variety to its comedy. This variety and unpredictability is also present on a more premise-based level. As previously mentioned, a big problem with more subpar comedies is that they become repetitive and predictable. The most recent example for me was with Season 2 of Takagi-san, which I was initially hyped for, but found that I couldn't even make it through the first episode of the new season because the jokes had become so repetitive. Nishikata is doing something at home or at school, Takagi enters the scenario and throws him off, he tries to counter Takagi, and then he fails and gets embarrassed. With the exception of the 3 other schoolgirls and their shenanigans, you've basically seen all the jokes the series has to offer by the end of its first episode. Nichijou, on the other hand, almost never runs out of ideas for new jokes, which makes it easier for the audience to stay invested. One minute, the 3 main girls are just joking around with each other, and then suddenly the principal is suplexing a deer in the school courtyard, and then it drifts into something almost completely abstract with its Helvetica Standard segments. There are basically no rules or set structures when it comes to Nichijou's comedy, and that high level of variety helps keep the audience's attention. Because the premise for Nichijou is so broad, literally just the everyday lives of different people, it allows for a wider range of subjects to tackle. The more specific a premise becomes, which tends to happen a lot in anime, the less room there is for variety when it comes to humor. To pull from a series I've mentioned in the past, Jashin Dropkick was a series that I initially thought was genuinely hilarious because of how dark its humor got and how well executed that humor was. Unfortunately, it felt like it only had one joke in its arsenal. Jashin tries to kill Yurine and fails each time, resulting in her being horrifically maimed. So by the time we get to the 3rd iteration of this joke in a row, I've lost interest. With a premise as specific as a witch summons a demon from hell who tries to kill her but keeps failing, it puts too much focus on the premise itself and doesn't allow for many other ideas to be explored. Another way that Nichijou accomplishes this variety is its cast size. When you have a smaller number of characters to work with, the combinations of personalities and usable situations are fairly limited, so you'll end up reusing certain ideas too much. Going back to Takagi-san, most of the focus is on Takagi and Nishikata. There really isn't a whole lot of input from the supporting cast, so it's unintentionally limiting itself on what kind of ideas can be presented because there are only a few different ways that Takagi and Nishikata interact with each other. With Nichijou, not only are there at least 6 main characters divided into 2 separate groups, but also dozens of side characters that make frequent appearances across the entire series. Sometimes it's just Yuko and her friends being goofy, sometimes it's Mio and her sister, Yuko and her mom, Yuko and the principal and vice principal, Yuko and Nano and Nakamura, and so on. The combinations of characters are seemingly endless, thus the different types of scenarios and personality combinations are plentiful enough to fill an entire series without getting repetitive. Even the intensity of the comedy goes through different levels of variance. Rather than try to go full-on belly laugh for every single joke, a lot of Nichijou's humor purposefully elicits no more than a mild giggle. This might seem like an odd choice at first. Why would you not want to go all out as much as you can? Well, if you constantly stay at the same level of intensity, and that intensity is constantly cranked up to 11, then you don't really have anywhere to go from there. The audience will eventually get used to this intensity level, and the extreme will become mundane and leave less of an impact. By varying the intensity of the humor as well as the style of humor in play, Nichijou avoids this perceived intensity drop-off, cycling through different levels of intensity in order to keep the audience engaged. Above all else though, I think what Nichijou best succeeds at in the most subtle of ways is that it really isn't just a comedy. In fact, most of the really good anime comedies aren't just comedies. They have something else to offer besides a never-ending succession of setups and payoffs. In the case of Nichijou, that something else is slice of life, which, in hindsight, is the main focus for just as much, if not more, of the show than the straight comedy elements. Normally, that'd be pretty obvious with a title like My Ordinary Life, but because the early jokes are so over-the-top and hard-hitting, it appears to be focusing on the comedy more. It isn't until we get to the tamer, more subdued punchlines that the slice-of-life elements really start to settle in. By the time I reached the last few episodes, I honestly wasn't even looking forward to the comedy that much at all. It was still really good comedy, but because the characters had been slowly built up to the point where they felt like genuine human beings with complex personalities and aspirations, rather than just a bunch of goofy stock characters making jokes at each other, I was much more invested in their everyday lives, instead of just the spastic jokes that they were part of. Both of these elements are integral to the identity of this series. You can't have the lows without the highs, the mundane without the extraordinary. This concept is so embedded in the more metatextual narrative of Nichijou that Mio's lines in the penultimate episode almost feel profound despite their simplicity. You never know what's going to happen. That's what makes it interesting. The lives of these characters might seem wacky and fantastical because we're viewing them through the lens of a comedy series, but because these moments are more so the exception rather than the norm, they become more interesting than a constant stream of over-the-top humor. Even the ever-changing ending themes for the series reinforce this idea of variety and the shift towards highlighting the slice-of-life elements, especially in the final episodes where it sounds like the characters are singing a graduation hymn, beckoning the audience to look back on all the fun times and see how far we've come. In retrospect, it's really not all that surprising that a Kyoto animation series was so effective at making the wackiest of anime comedy feel that much more down-to-earth and personal. And now that I've finished it and can see the big picture, I'd definitely be down for a rewatch sometime in the future so I can appreciate the earlier moments even more. This video topic was selected by my patrons. As part of my Break the Backlog tier, those who pledge $3 or more will have access to a monthly poll in which they get to vote on what shows from my backlog I will make a video about in the following month. So check out the link in the description below to further support my videos. Special thanks to Jan Rogalski, Rourke Tanjoin, Christine Seibert, Call Me Catlord, Ryan Johnson, Eugenio Mendoza, and all my other patrons for their generous support. My name is Ember, and I'll see you next time.